Hey loves, it's Britt, and in this video I wanted to talk about some of the natal chart placements that I feel are the most difficult to have. So starting off, I want to say the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, or Jupiter squaring Saturn are some of the most difficult aspects that you can have, with a double emphasis on the Moon square Saturn, which I feel is the most difficult aspect you can have in your natal chart. And I'll explain why. Saturn in a square aspect to any of these planets creates a feeling of hardship and struggle and suffering in the life. And it can often show that there are, many challenges in the upbringing, and there's an environment that has instilled a very deep cloak of pessimism onto the person. And it's really hard to break free of that because Saturn in itself as an energy is very constricting, very like an energy of just kind of like being crushed or being burdened by external circumstances, and sometimes even by internal circumstances, your own fears and thoughts. So these squares I feel like are the most difficult. The moon being the worst because the moon is our emotional self and it's how we feel. And so the moon square Saturn aspect can often show that there is a tendency toward depression and a very deep ingrained unconscious feeling of low self-worth. The next set of aspects that I feel like are the most difficult to have in the natal chart are squares to the moon. So kind of coming back to what I said about moon square Saturn, but now just emphasizing any square to the moon is a very deeply ingrained blockage, because the moon is such a deep part of us, representing our inner child, our childhood upbringing, even our past lives, and our unconscious emotional primal self. So squares to the moon can be especially difficult because we are unconscious of why we have these conflicts, but yet we can't quite seem to emotionally break free of the bondage. And it takes a lot of effort to change the negative programming or negative internal messages of moon squares. So double emphasis being moon squaring Saturn. And moon squaring Uranus is also especially difficult because Uranus can show sudden, shocking upsets and traumas, and usually there has been a few or a lot of sudden, shocking, upsetting traumas in the moon person's life, or the moon square Uranus person's life. The next most difficult aspect I feel like in the natal chart is actually if you have more than two inconjuncts or quincunxes in your natal chart. One is like manageable, but when you start getting more like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, this is incredibly awkward and debilitating and takes a lot of inner work to be able to just express yourself. Because the thing with the inconjunct aspect or the quincunx aspect is that we're even more different than an opposition or a square. We are just totally not understanding each other, those two signs. And so it creates a lot of awkwardness, self-doubt, fears, and also like a feeling and an actual reality of sometimes ineffectiveness in life. So it takes a lot to resolve if we have a lot of quincunxes in our natal chart. The next most difficult aspect, or I guess this isn't an aspect, but the 29th degree. So the 29th degree can also be very lucky because it is a degree of mastery, but it almost always, or pretty much always, associates or is attributed to some level of crisis in the life. So the lifetime is not easy when we have a 29th degree planet. And especially if it's a planet like Saturn or Pluto, even more so, this can be extremely difficult because we're going from one energy to the next. We're closing out the cycle, so we often experience the most difficult energy of that sign and that planet that is at 29 degrees. So that is the next most difficult natal chart placement. The last most difficult chart placement is a stellium in the 6th or the 12th house. So these two houses tend to be associated with some degree of difficulty and suffering. The quote about the 6th or the 12th house is serve or suffer. So if there's a stellium of planets in either of these houses, the lifetime is not particularly easy. There is a lot of giving up the ego that has to happen. That is not an easy task. And with the 6th house, there can be health problems. Actually, with the 12th house too, there can be health problems. There can be crisis to do with emotional things or health related things. So these two houses having a stellium there is quite difficult. The 12th house stellium can also be associated with extreme self-doubt and confusion about our identity, especially if the sun is a part of it.